Welcome back. For the next little bit, I'd like to think together with you about the Book of Esther. I mean, right between the temples being rebuilt, between 520 and 516 back in Jerusalem, and Ezra's return in 458, and Nehemiah's first term as governor of the province of Yehud, or Judah, something's going on back in Persia. My take is that if, as Paul claims in Romans 15, these accounts in the First Testament are written for our instruction, that through perseverance and the encouragement of Scriptures, we might have hope. Not hope, but confident expectation. Then, what's the significance of the account of Esther to you and to me? Well, I'm sure you've heard the observation, maybe even criticism, that the name of God doesn't even appear in the Book of Esther. And so later on, some rabbis question whether or not it really belongs in the Bible. But even though the name of God doesn't appear in the narrative of Esther, what evidence do you see of His presence and His power? Well, if you were fortunate enough to have a real world history course in high school or a solid history of Western Civ course in university, then you're familiar with the Greco-Persian Wars. I mean, that massive invasion across the Hellespont with huge battles at Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea. The biggest military operation in history to that time. Well, I bring that up because the commander-in-chief of that invading Persian army was the Emperor Xerxes himself, also known as Ahasuerus, or I think as a lot of English readers, Ahasuerus, or some pronunciation like that. The Greek historian Herodotus indicates that the feast that we read about in Esther chapter 1 was connected with the planning conference in the year 483 BC. That's the third year of Xerxes' reign. He was planning for this upcoming invasion of Greece, and here we find this little Jewish community right in the middle of that. Key verse for Esther? I think chapter 4, verse 14. In that setting, Mordecai is challenging, if you keep silent at a time like this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. I think a clear allusion to God's providence in the affairs of history. Well, what's the genre of the book? My take of the evidence is that Esther is historical narrative. Now, you know from your background reading that there's a significant body of scholarship who don't share a high view of Scripture and argue that the genre of Esther is a novella, a work of fiction. Others see shades of wisdom in the narrative, and I can see that, but my take is it's historical narrative based on the evidence. As I argued early on in our survey of the First Testament, there's demonstrably and intentionally a remarkable unity in the Bible. And in that vein, it should really come as no surprise that in Esther, any more than any of the books of the exilic and post-exilic period, a very basic question would be in focus, namely, whether or not God had pulled the plug on the promised covenant, even with respect to those who, for whatever reason, took a pass on the opportunity to return to Judah. In this case, Israel's very existence is under threat once again. I mean, think of it. If you were to ask, What's the worst thing could happen to a community in exile? I think most of the experiences at the top of your list play out in the Book of Esther. These dramatic events take place outside the land, but it shows that they don't take place outside of Yahweh's purview. Again, that key verse in 4:14, Mordecai's message to Esther, if you don't want to get involved, if you want to keep silence, God's still going to bring deliverance. But you and your father's house will miss out. So Esther, Ferris, who knows whether you've not come into the kingdom for such a time as this. God's amazing providence. The structure of the Book of Esther isn't complicated. The first couple of chapters, at least through chapter 2, verse 20, you've got Esther's rise. Chapter 2, verse 21, and then all the way through chapter 7, the camera shifts, and now it's this tension between Mordecai, the Jew, and Haman. Then what happens in chapters 8 through 9? Israel is miraculously and providentially delivered, and then the fourth section, chapter 10, Israel's peace and security. So, the theme of Esther is God's commitment to the Promise Project is demonstrated by his providential protection of his people. I mean, Yahweh was their refuge, and no international intrigue or evil domestic plot would succeed in exterminating them and pulling the plug on the Promise Project. Think about it. We'll see you in a bit.